This is what Vikings were actually like. The ancient Norse, also known as the Vikings, were considered seafarers, large, brutish, and killed everything in their path. Although this is what popular culture tells us, it isn't true. The Vikings weren't barbarians and were a group of civilized, intelligent people who worked hard. Many cultures didn't understand the Vikings' unique culture and belief system, which helped them gain the reputation that people still believe today. If you want to know what the Vikings were really like, you're in for a treat. This is what the Vikings were actually like. Vikings believed in personal hygiene. When you see pictures of Vikings, they have long, matted hair and straggly beards, but this is just part of the story that people have made up over the years. The Vikings weren't classless, dirty, or smelly. They cared a lot for their hygiene. They did have beards because they lived in harsh conditions, but their beards and hair were always combed, and the Vikings took care of themselves. Viking grooming tools and equipment were discovered and used by men and women. Combs, razors, and ear swabs were found, showing that the Vikings cared about their appearance. They didn't wear horned helmets. Most pictures of Vikings show them wearing horned helmets, but this has been proven false. If they wore helmets during battle, there's no evidence of them having horns, and no artifacts have ever been found to prove the theory. The horned helmet idea came from the Victorian era to romanticize their image. The Vikings were described as scary people, and having horned helmets made them look terrifying and savage, but none of this is true. The days of the week represent Viking gods. The Vikings worshipped Norse gods, but did you know this is part of our everyday lives? The days of the week reference specific gods. For example, the god Odin, who is also known as Woden, is now Wednesday, and the word means Woden's Day. Tuesday and Friday were named after Tyr and Frigg, the god and goddess of war and marriage. Thor is the most famous god and is the god of strength and thunder for Thursday. Even though the Viking culture is lost, their legend is part of modern life. The Vikings had a justice system. Stories of the Vikings tell us that they were cruel and killing was part of their everyday lives, which isn't true. The Vikings didn't settle problems through violence and had a justice system to handle disputes and crimes. The justice system was known as Althing, meaning the Thing. The Thing was overseen by a law speaker who would hear people's disputes through an objective third party, similar to our modern court system. There were cases where justice required violence and execution, but this didn't happen all the time, and a peaceful resolution was always the goal when possible. Vikings were farmers, not raiders. The Vikings are said to have been fierce warriors and raiders, but they didn't fight all the time. If they were on the sea looking for treasure and fighting, the Vikings would never have been able to create a complex society. In reality, most Vikings spent their time farming and keeping their settlements strong. Some of the most famous Vikings in history were farmers, and farming was a respected job. Ragnar Lothbrok started as a farmer before he was put into a position of power. Many farmers doubled as warriors when necessary, but didn't spend all their time on the seas wreaking havoc. They weren't united. The Vikings settled in what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Each group had its own leader and its own communities, and many didn't call themselves Vikings. This term referred to all Scandinavians involved in overseas expeditions, so they were all put into one category. Different groups were often at war, and even though they were all called Vikings, the groups wouldn't raid together because the groups didn't want to share with one another. The Vikings were skiers. People today love hitting the slopes to go skiing, but did you know that people have been skiing for close to 6,000 years? During the Viking Age, skiing was a means of transportation during the winter when most of the land was covered in snow and ice. Later, it was discovered that they might have also used skiing as a form of recreation. In Norse mythology, Ullr is the god of skiing, and skiing also helped the Vikings in warfare. They went skiing to scout the wilderness to move their armies across terrain that would otherwise be impossible to pass. Weak children suffered a horrible fate. Strength and health were necessities for Viking children. If a child were born sick or weak, they wouldn't have been able to contribute to society or fight, so they were considered a burden. These children would be thrown in the ocean or abandoned in the forest to save their resources and time. The Vikings considered this a mercy because there was no time to coddle a child. Only about 80% of Viking children made it to their 5th birthday. and those who did were expected to work and fight just like adults. Sadly, Viking children never knew what it was like to be a kid. The Vikings reached North America before Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus received the credit for discovering North America, but 500 years before Columbus and his crew landed there, North America was discovered by a group of Vikings led by Leif Erikson. Leif's father, Eric the Red, was a famous traveler and established the first European settlement of Greenland. Eric the Red was said to have sailed from Iceland to Canada and encouraged his son to explore the new land as well. When Leif and the Vikings discovered North America, they didn't try to attack the Native Americans, and most people didn't know that the Vikings discovered North America before Christopher Columbus. Vikings weren't as large as people believe. Vikings are said to be giant, muscular men and could kill an enemy with one swing of an axe. In reality, they weren't huge men like Chris Hemsworth and Thor. A Viking man's average height was 5 feet 7 inches and was more lean than muscular. The summer season back then was short, so they didn't have the resources and food they needed to get through the winter months. The poor weather and lack of resources led the Vikings to go on raids to take resources from others. They've only been described as large, muscular men to make them seem scarier and inhuman. Vikings may not have had tattoos. Tattooing was an art that came along well before the Vikings, but they may not have had tattoos. Today, people celebrate their Viking heritage by getting traditional Viking tattoos, but it's unclear if these were real tattoos or just ancient Norse symbols. Vikings on TV shows and movies are covered in tattoos, but no evidence exists that they practiced the art. Vikings were clean and obsessed with their appearance, so it's unlikely they'd cover themselves in permanent markings. Vikings had an interesting way to start fires. Fires were necessary to keep the Vikings alive during the cold winters. Although they were obsessed with their appearance, that all went out the window when lighting a fire. The Vikings would collect touchwood fungus from the tree bark and boil it in human urine for days. Next, the soaked bark would be pounded into a felt-like substance that was light and durable enough to transport. The sodium nitrate in the urine allowed the material to smolder rather than burn, so they could travel long distances and start a new fire as they traveled. The dead were buried in boats. Viking life revolved around the ocean, whether they were sailing, fishing, or raiding. Since they were often on the water, it was only appropriate for the burials would involve boats. Norse religion says that great warriors needed a vessel to cross into the afterlife to reach Valhalla, and all prominent men and exceptional women would have the honor of being laid to rest aboard a traditional Viking ship. Along with the body, the Viking would fill the boat with food, treasure, weapons, and anything they might need in the afterlife. Also, slaves were sacrificed and put on the boat so they could serve their masters in the afterlife. Viking afterlife. Many religions believe in heaven and hell, but the Vikings had a different view. They believed in several afterlife realms, and the way they lived their lives would dictate which realm they would go to when they died, and the best place was Valhalla. Valhalla was reserved for warriors who had fought bravely and died in battle. Helgafell is another place for good people who lead fulfilling lives. Dishonorable people who didn't die well were said to go to Helheim, as did men who died comfortably of old age. Viking shroomed before battle. Many people today use magic mushrooms as a recreational drug, and the Vikings used them centuries ago. They would go crazy after eating the mushrooms and believed they were possessed by a force that would provide them the power the Vikings needed for the long battle. In reality, they were just high. The Vikings were said to have loved the feeling they got while eating the mushrooms, and many historians believe the drugs weren't the only thing that made the Vikings go berserk. Historians believe the Vikings had PTSD and often had episodes before the battle. Vikings had slaves. Vikings often acquired slaves on raiding expeditions in the British Isles or Eastern Europe. Also, a Viking could become an enslaved person as a form of punishment. The Vikings used slave trading as a commodity, which was very lucrative. The Vikings would trade goods or other slaves depending on their needs. Slaves helped the Vikings with farming, running their households, and other essential tasks in the community. The enslaved people were treated like livestock, had no rights or freedoms, and were at the will of their owners. Vikings were allowed to set slaves free if they earned their freedom, or someone could buy a slave's freedom. They had grills. You often see rappers and athletes wearing gold teeth, known as grills. Grills aren't modern accessories, and Viking skulls were found with filing carved in their teeth during an archaeological dig in 2009. It's believed that the modification was a status symbol, and the more modifications a Viking had, the richer they were. Vikings preferred blonde hair. In Viking culture, blonde hair was a sign of beauty, and everyone wanted blonde hair. The women who weren't born with blonde hair would use a strong soap with high lye concentration to bleach their hair. Men were said to bleach their beards to have as much blonde hair visible as possible, proving that back then blondes did have more fun. Today, women and men who want blonde hair have access to much safer dyes to change their hair color. Viking women had basic rights. Viking women weren't treated as equals to men, but they had more rights than other women around the world during that time. Women often married around the age of 12 and were expected to carry out motherly and wifely duties, but they did have fundamental rights. Viking women could inherit property, file for divorce, and reclaim settlements if the marriage ended. Viking men were considered the men of the house, but women controlled things. If a Viking woman's husband died, she inherited everything, including their husband's role and responsibilities. Although it was rare, some Viking women were warriors, known as shield maidens, and fought alongside the Viking men. Vikings used soup to gauge the severity of a wound. Today, if a person suffers a severe abdominal wound, doctors use CAT scans, MRIs, and exploratory surgery to determine the severity of the injury. The Vikings didn't have this technology and used soup. When the Vikings returned from battle, those with severe abdominal injuries were given a strong onion soup with other spices. After a few minutes, they would smell the wound. If they could smell the onions from inside, it meant the injury was severe, and the warrior would likely succumb to their wounds.